as you've been talking to other entrepreneurs, as you've just been kind of witnessing the market, what are some of the most common things that you think people who are founding startups get wrong?
I think one thing would be that it will go quickly. Um, whatever they think the arc of the company might be, whatever success they hope to achieve, that they think that they'll achieve that in 6 months or a year and a half, and that often it takes longer or considerably longer than that. I think that just because you have a good idea that the world would beat a path to your door, as the expression, isn't true. Just because you've come up with something interesting or valuable to some group of people somewhere doesn't mean that those people will be able to find you. You have to be able to market your product, sell your product, sort of, find the people that might find it interesting and bring it to them. Another one that we've talked about is that money binarily helps, that having more money means more success, and that's not necessarily the case, or more employees, more people means more success, whereas that might not necessarily be the case. Sometimes keeping a leaner team, keeping focus, not being able to do everything because you just raised several $1,000,000, but only being able to do a few things actually means your company has a greater chance at succeeding.
And I'm curious too, as you've kind of observed all of these feelings, where do you think they come from? Do they come from disparate places? Do they all kind of stem from the same misconceptions?
I mean, Gary Vaynerchuk talks a lot about how trendy entrepreneurship is and how everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. You might scroll through Instagram and see someone with entrepreneur in their bio quite frequently. I was surprised when, a couple of years ago, I was at my parents' house and they had a bunch of older friends around the dinner table, and I sort of expressed that I was an entrepreneur. And I felt as though perhaps 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, that would have been seen as very other, but it was very accepted. So I think there's just a breaking free of the sort of pattern of working in the same industry for a decade or two or three and sort of doing the rote, traditional, mindless thing that perhaps generations before did, casting out on your own and pursuing what brings you joy and what interests you and what excites you. It's starting something, building something with your bare hands. There's a romanticization of that, I think. So I think in that romanticization, a lot of the fact that most startups fail and how very challenging it is glossed over.
And to get back to our topic at hand, what would you say is the top reason that you think startups fail?
Probably generally that the founder or founders weren't truly in it from the onset, or that they lose faith in their idea or lose their nerve, lose the ability to keep showing up and sort of once more into the breach, day after day after day. I think whatever success I've accomplished along my journey, which is all very relative. I mean, I think we've far from succeeded. But whatever success I've enjoyed has come from this expression we've talked about a couple of times. There are only lead bullets, no silver bullets. Just sort of day after day after day, showing up and putting in the work. And there really are very few days where you have seismic leaps. So I think the main reason that startups fail that I see is that people were in it from the wrong reason from the jump, or that after a year or two, their life circumstances change and they no longer want to live that lifestyle because it's sort of grim.
How do you keep motivating yourself to keep going?
We've talked about this too. I think for the first 3 or 4 years, I was motivating myself with what we've talked about as dark motivational force, fear, insecurity, embarrassment. I just cared a lot what other people thought about me and what my parents and friends and so on. And, I didn't want them to view me as a failure or some sort of fuck up if I walked away, or that if it failed. I think what keeps me going now is there was an idea in my brain, there always has been, for my company. And only in the past year, maybe 4 years in or so, has that really unequivocally and quite objectively started coming to life in the world. So my vision, my idea, my ideal is actually taking root in the actual world, and I'm seeing the humble beginnings. It's sort of like, I don't know if you've ever planted a garden, but like you almost don't believe anything will happen because they're these little tiny dry seeds that you're just like putting in the soil and putting water. It's just the simplest formula that just seems like it couldn't possibly yield anything meaningful. And then sure enough, if you're lucky, you know, little 1, 2, 3 inch sprouts come up out of the ground. And obviously you can't, that's not the full vegetable. That's not the end goal, but you see like, oh, this actually is happening. This can actually work. So I think what motivates me now is that I'm seeing my idea bloom, and I'm seeing that it really could be what I thought it could be. And that motivates me and excites me.
You've also mentioned in the past that your background and just your general love for photography kind of not necessarily informed, but possibly influenced the work that you're doing now. Let's say an entrepreneur doesn't really have that innate sense of calling. How can they either trick themselves into kind of creating that calling? How can they recalibrate? Or should they take that as a sign that they should find something else?
Well, it's interesting you framed the question that way, because I was talking to a photographer yesterday, actually, um, about the irony of, you know, for example, I started a company that's obviously very centered on photography, and I do love photography, but I actually do so little photography. And that's sort of the irony of like when you start a company, if you start a, you know, coffee brand is the example we always give, you're really not making coffee. You know, like you're not really like, it's not about the coffee. It's about like marketing and legal and accounting and, you know, dealing with employees and dealing with customers and any number of things all day, every day. And as the company grows, you ironically get further in at times from the original love. Maybe other people, maybe the whole reason you're doing it is, right, like for me with the hub, there is sort of a beauty to the fact that there are all these kids that can be photographers more easily than perhaps they could have otherwise because of what I've created. But the irony and the tragedy is that I actually am further than I've ever been from being a photographer proper. In terms of tricking yourself, I think as a function of that point, entrepreneurship isn't necessarily about the reason that you started it. It's about the many puzzles and challenges along the way. So I love software development, as it turns out. Like I love the process of building software and working with developers. And like, that's something that I knew nothing about prior to this. I love strategy and putting together a really good presentation that expresses an idea very well, whether it's to raise money or present to my board of advisors or any number of things. So there are things along the way that aren't necessarily the idea proper, but the operational blocking and tackling that I think you can fall in love with and look forward to.
And as you've met people and maybe they've given you advice, is there any advice that you keep on going back to about how to kind of break away from the pack of entrepreneurship and these startups that are failing?
Yeah, one of my mentors always gives very cryptic advice, and he says, every idea can succeed. It's just a matter of your time frame. I still don't really know if I believe that or even know what he meant. But something I often say, we've talked about before, the difference between a pivot and failure. You know, and a pivot is just hitting a brick wall at 100 miles an hour, getting back in the car and going a totally opposite direction. And failure is running into a wall at 100 miles an hour and stopping because your car is totaled. But they both involve crashing into a wall. So I think just continuing is the answer. I mean, like a startup fails when the founder stops. My company is a lot smaller than it's been in its biggest, you know, but I kept going. And people that I would have thought were central to the company have left, or, you know, any number of things have happened that could have caused us to fail or stop. But I think if the nucleus, which is really just the founder or the founding team, is still bought in and still pushing forward, and someone is still taking care of those little seeds beneath the soil, they have a chance to bloom. So just not giving up, I think, just persistence, living to fight another day. Another thing I say is letting serendipity run its course. I don't really believe in fate or even luck so much. It's just like, I'm more and more, we're starting to work with large companies. Like we just did a huge project with Kellogg's. And a lot of these big companies take forever. It might be a year and a half after an initial conversation before they're really ready. I think this relationship with Kellogg's will grow and grow and grow and be at its biggest in sort of 3 to 5 years, is what I was just saying to one of my employees yesterday. So we have to be alive in 3 to 5 years in order to fully, to go back to my gardening analogy, it's like a tomato ripening or something. Like just because that little shoot's coming up, it's going to be a long time before you have a big, ripe, juicy red tomato. So you have to be alive long enough to let it sort of run its course, to let serendipity run its course, so that when you do get that call, when so-and-so remembers your company 18 months from now, you're still around to answer the phone.
And my last question on this topic, is there ever a moment where you believe that a founder or a team should just kind of see the writing on the wall and actually, take the failure?
I don't know. I ask myself that a lot. An analogy I give sometimes are those old school mazes. Sometimes you'd even draw them as like I draw them as a kid, right? You draw like a very complicated configuration with a lot of dead ends and so on, but there is a way through the maze. And one of the things I do as a founder with these strategy sessions with my chief of staff or alone or with my board or whatever is like trying to get out of the maze. And so in other words, what I do is, here's where we are today. If I do this and then do that, and then this happens, and then this lucky break, and then we come over here, and then this, and then that, can we get out of this situation and can we still reach success? And sometimes you'll go like through 3 or 4 paths that actually, like that won't work. Fuck, like that won't work because of this, or that won't work because of that. And I've never actually started a thought exercise like that and finished with no way out. There's always a way out for me, and maybe that's because my idea is destined to succeed. Maybe that's because I'm more creative than most. I don't know. But I just know that I've never gone through the maze exercise without believing in a path. And if you're like, I believe that, yeah, it will take a couple lucky breaks and so on, but there is a way out of this, then you can like push forward that day. And what happens, of course, is that the next day or week or month, things shift, the data shifts. And so therefore it's a new maze and you have to do the exercise over. But so long as every time you do the maze, you can get out, you can keep believing. I think if you fundamentally as a founder realize that there's no way out and you're boxed in any way that you can think of is futile, then yeah, you should probably pack it in, return money to investors, set your employees free, set yourself free. But if you fundamentally believe and want to keep going, I don't see why you shouldn't if there's a way out.